Hi, everybody. It's CC and JT from the CC and JT Amateur Hour. Productive values go to die. And boy, today we are totally honored to be joined by
John Glionna.
John Glionna is a former, let me get this right, a former Los Angeles Times national correspondent, which is so cool because, journalists are some of our favorite people. But that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about your books. And John, I'm gonna embarrass you right up from the front, and I don't do this intentionally. In preparation for this podcast, you sent us a PDF of Rebels and Outliers, Real Stories of the American West, which is why we're here. And I got so entranced. I said, I can't do this, John. I can't read this for free. So I bought your book this morning. I bought your book this morning. So right off of Kindle. So, and then I saw that you wrote a couple of Nevada books, Outbook Nevada. And I went and I cheated there, and I went to Libby and I downloaded it there. So I've got your books are in my to be read file. So thank you for doing that. So that's how entranced I am by your writing. That's how excited I am about this. So please, please, please introduce yourselves more fully and let us learn more about John.
Well, but let me just start off by saying you're a wise man, Robert, because it's the CC and JT show, not the JT and CC show, and so knows this place, in the law firm thing. So yeah, hey, hello to all the listeners out there in CC and JT land. My name's John Glionna, as our host said. I'm a former LA Times writer for many, many, many years, 26 years, in fact. And I kind of did the gambit of different writing assignments. I wrote about California. I was a San Francisco bureau chief for many years. I was a foreign correspondent in covering East Asia. I lived in Seoul, South Korea. And then I ended my career at the Times, which ended in 2015 as a national correspondent. I was based in Vegas, and I traveled around to the West. Mostly, I think I did a few stories like north to South Dakota, but mostly it was west of that. So, and a lot of it was of my reporting. Since I was based in Vegas, I did a lot of reporting about Nevada. And as JT mentioned, I do have a couple of other books. Just briefly, the first book I published was called Real Stories from the Outback Nevada. Real Stories from the Silver State. That's a collection of stories that I wrote pretty much for the Review Journal in Las Vegas, and they were stories that I went out into the ether and I wrote about small towns and what Nevada was really like. And the book really was a testimony in my mind, that an answer to the question that many people ask: is there anything out there between Vegas and Reno? And hell yeah, there is. That's where the real Nevada is. And so I went to just a lot of small towns and wrote about real people. And one of those stories that I did turned into my second book, it's called No Friday Night Lights, and it's reservation football on the edge of America. And I spent a season with a very small football team on the border of Nevada and Oregon, McDermott, Nevada, and they were an 8-man football team. And it was a book about why people choose to live in rural, hyper rural areas, and how what they endure to sort of defend their lifestyle and keep it going. And so that book was published by the University of Nebraska Press. And so this book that hopefully we can talk about a little bit tonight is another collection. So the first is a collection, the second's a traditional nonfiction narrative. And this is a collection of stories I did mostly for the Los Angeles Times and a few other outlets that sort of plot my, if you put a beacon on me like they do sharks and birds, you'll see that I kind of move around and I kind of stay away from big cities, and I go places. So it plots where I have been. And I think what the book is sort of like, I've had a lot of adventures. I mean, that's what I really set out to do in my career as a journalist. I wanted, I didn't want to cover the White House. I didn't want to cover the State House. I didn't want to cover the police department. I didn't want to be a political reporter. I wanted to be the guy that they would send out there, like, as I write in the foreword to this book, which is Rebels and Outliers, Real Stories of the American West. I was a big fan of Charles Kuralt when I was a kid. And, on Sunday mornings, he would, you never knew where Kuralt was going to take you. And what I particularly liked, and you guys are of my generation, at the end he always let the camera roll, and they didn't say anything. So if there were birds or if they were out in the wild, and so I always try to keep in mind when I was out there in a story that sometimes I needed to let the camera roll and not be talking. And so let the people I'm writing about sort of take center stage. The book. A friend asked me once, she's like, what's the benefit of, like, these stories are published? What's the benefit of republishing them? And what I like about it is I can hold this book in my hand, and it's purple, and it has a picture of Shiprock on it, which is out in the middle of the Navajo Nation. And in the same, it's in the same collection. There are stories that were written years apart and from different editors, perhaps from different outlets, but they all kind of are similar about the fascinating people that populate the modern American West, and the characters, and the resilience. I mean, I've been pretty much of an outsider, because I grew up in upstate New York, and as the outsider, there's something about seeing a place for the first time that sharpens your attention. You notice things that locals might not. You ask questions that haven't been asked in years. You're not weighed down by the same assumptions, and sometimes that gives you insights that others overlook, even though they've lived in a place all their lives. And I came looking for stories. That's why I showed up in town. I parachuted in, usually rental car, and what I got was an education, really, in resilience and community and solitude and things that I didn't even know I needed to learn. That's really what I think is an important part of this book. For example, one of the stories is about a phone booth that is in the middle of the Mojave Desert, and that for a while I wrote the story in 1999, and at the time the internet was just getting started, and here was this kind of connection between old school technology of Ma Bell and wired connectivity. And then the phone booth became an internet sensation because they had put it in what there used to be. Now, this was located somewhere between LA and Vegas, and there used to be a mine there during the 70s and 80s. The truckers would leave, and Ma Bell put a phone booth there because they'd say, "Yeah, I'm leaving with the load. I'm going to be on the 15." And the mine closed. The road wasn't repaired, and it went back into dust. But for some reason, Ma Bell let the phone booth stay there. So a hiker was coming out one day to take a hike 7 miles off the nearest road, and he sees a phone booth like a mirage. Picked it up. There's a dial tone, and he posted on the internet and that, hey, there's this thing out there. So fairly not long afterwards, the Mojave Desert phone booth started getting calls from around the entire world. I don't know if you're game for writers to do a bit of reading. I wouldn't mind reading the beginning of this to let your listeners know what it sounds like. Can I go ahead and do that?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So the Mojave Desert phone booth. The dateline is Mojave National Preserve, California, with only the lazy Joshua trees and hovering buzzards out here to bear witness. This isolated expanse of high desert plain could well be among the quietest places on the planet. By day, the summer heat hammers hard, and the dull whistle of the wind is the only discernible noise. Come nightfall, the eerie silence is often pierced by the woeful bleat of a wandering burro. But wait, there's another sound. Ring along a line of wooden power poles running to the horizon in both directions, 14 miles from the nearest paved road. A solitary payphone beckons with the shrill sound of impatient civilization. Then it rings again and again, and yet again, often dozens of times a day. The callers, a bored housewife from New Zealand, a German high school student, an on-the-job Seattle stockbroker, a long-distance trucker who dials in from the road. There's a proud skunk owner from Atlanta, a pizza delivery man from San Bernardino, California, and a bill collector from Denver who got given a bum steer while tracing a debt. Receivers in hand, they're reaching out at all hours of the day and night from nearly every continent on the globe to make contact with this forlorn desert outpost. They're calling the Mojave Desert phone booth. That story was it helped launch me into, I would always say, like a guy who had a top 40 hit. I tapped into something there. There was just something so weird that in my career became known to my colleagues as the Glionna story. That's a Glionna story. And whatever that makings of the Glionna story was, hopefully the writing was engaging. It was something that others might have overlooked. And an editor, one of the foreign editors, when I worked in Seoul, made a comment to another editor that Glionna could find a story on the way to the outhouse. Now, I hope that was a compliment. I'm not sure. It sure sounds like one, but Robert, you're rolling your eyes. It's like, well, it depends what I come back with, right?
Backhanded compliment.
Sure, I'll take it. So, yeah, I mean, In 2 pages away from the Mojave Desert phone booth, there was a story about the night watchman of Alcatraz and how every night when Alcatraz closes and the last tourist boat goes, there's a guy who stays there overnight. It's a scary. I was there with him for one night. I went up to San Quentin prison and did a story about the baseball team that plays all home games because they're inmates in jail largely for violent crime. Just people that I met along the way, and in this there are a few Nevada stories here in this collection. The first collection, Outback Nevada, is all Nevada stories. This has a smattering of Nevada along with other portions of the American West. This one of the stories about Nevada in this collection is a story about Bob, the pig farmer who lives outside of Las Vegas, and Bob Combs. And Bob and his wife run an installation where it's sort of like this cycle of life. Bob, for free, he'll go to all the casinos and pick up the remains from all the all you can eat stuff. He comes and he slopizes it, feeds it to his pigs. The pigs grow. And when it's time to bring them to market, he sells them to the casinos. And Bob is just a real character. And that's one of the things that I would say in my travels. We talk about James Lipscomb in his interviews. When I leave someone, and we do interviews, and I think it could be the same here in this interview, although our time together is short, I leave friends because, people, I make, a connection with people. So that's what this book brings. I think it's a trip around the West. It's one of those books that I read at night before I go to bed, and I get into bed before I'm ready to go to sleep. And that's where I do my reading. You can not worry about where you left off, but you can read a story or two a night. And I'm sort of open to. I don't want to ramble. I want to keep I want to keep the train online. I'm open to any questions. Or move over, Jimmy, and let Rover take over.
So, as you said, it's a collection of stories. I'm referring to specifically Rebels and Outliers. And I was going through the stories, and your writing style. And we're going to ask more about your writing style. But the writing style that I identified with is kind of a Steinbeck, which is, who also wrote Grapes of Wrath. And you even mentioned Steinbeck in the story that really stuck to my brain then, and that would be Dolores Westphal and her story of the RV crossing America in search of seasonal work. And so I don't so much want to ask about Dolores, but I do want to ask a story about Dolores. It seems like that would just be a book by itself. Grayson McClure and his health challenges, where he lived in Reno while he was getting those health challenges resolved. There's another book. Did you find yourself resisting writing biographies or about some of these people? Because some of these people just are fascinating.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Dolores passed away before we could revisit. You're right. It's a good question because there's a level of depth that one gets into. If you're out writing a daily story and I drop into your Carson City and interview somebody, an independent bookseller, and I go back and I write the story, I've gotten as much. If a story is a palette, I've gotten a kind of a Picasso start to the palette. If I do a magazine story, well, then it's much more detailed. But the level of detail that one would get into a book is much, much, much more. And so you want to say, for example, because I wrote for the Los Angeles Times, which is Hollywood's hometown newspaper, I would get emails and calls from people who were producers saying, there's a movie here, but they saw a snapshot, but they wanted to know, well, what's the story here? So sometimes the person's life, you would have to say whether there's enough depth there. And I'm not saying that there wasn't enough depth. If I didn't, I sometimes never went back. I did with Grayson. It's kind of funny. I only included one story, but I went back to visit Grayson a year or two later. His mom called me. They were back in Tennessee, and Grayson was like miraculously cured. And so I went to Tennessee and hung out with him as this young man. Completely different from the young the guy who's really on death's door and in so much pain. And we're still pals, I keep in touch with him, and his mother is just sort of really a sweet woman. The book that I ended up doing out of the first collection that became the No Friday Night Lights, it was that when I got up to McDermott, there were two coaches there, and One of them was a white guy who grew up in Reno and Carson City, and his name is Jack Smith. And his dad was a real interesting character. He was a former professional wrestler and boxer and boxing coach. And Jack grew up going out in the backseat of a car where Mo Smith took his boxers around on tour, became a boxer himself, and then was a professional for a while. Now here he is in a small town as a football and basketball coach. And his partner Richard Egan was a Native American, and he was Shoshone Paiute, and he grew up nearby on another reservation, but he moved there, played his last few years for McDermott, and was in 1982 was a star running back when they won the state championship. And Richard had this fascinating backstory that his grandfather, who lived in the time of Chief Winnemucca during the Indian Wars during the 60s, he was Chief Egan, and he was a chief of a band of traveling tribe. They lived mostly in southern Oregon, but Chief Egan was killed during a skirmish with the United States military, and in the end they cut his head off and brought it to Washington, where it sat on a shelf for 100 years, because they were, at the time, there was a sort of a eugenics movement that our grand scientists and doctors in Washington were trying to prove that the Native American was somewhat less human than we were, and that skull shape. So they took evidence, and it sat on a shelf. And in 1999, when Richard was a young man, they repatriated the chief's remains, and he was there with his older sister, who was a Native American woman, and they brought him back, and now they're buried near Burns. And so when I went up there, I learned all this later. I didn't know this when I first came, but what got me into the going back was I just liked Chief Egan. I'd call him, hey, and I never really played football when I was in high school, but I loved being able to call somebody coach. Hey, coach, what's up? Because their struggle and the story was it was such a small school, 8-man football team, and there was so few students that he had to go begging every year to get enough kids to even field an 8-man squad. So the question every May was, well, coach, how's it look for this fall? You going to get enough boys to come out? And, well, John, I think I got 7 confirmed. I go, what do you give me a percentage? So at one point I just said, I want to come up for a whole season, because I didn't get enough of Richard and Jack, and the boys I found, and I'll be curious if this comes through, if you get to reading this book, but that I didn't really relate to the boys that much. They were I thought I would be this avuncular hipster from the big city, and they can, wow, you live in in the big city. But these boys were they were very rural. They were very conservative. Many of them were from the reservation. There was just too much hurdle. I tried to relate as much as I could. In fact, I asked both coaches. I said, how do I relate? Because I don't have children of my own. And they were just, you got to be yourself. And I didn't have enough time there where I really kind of I don't keep in touch with any of the kids. But Jack and Richard are dear friends of mine. So what was it that made me go from the story to the book? It was Richard's voice on the telephone. It really was. And it's like, and people ask me, what's a book versus a magazine story? And you kind of know when you see it. You're like that Supreme Court judge asked to look at pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And when there's a book there's a book. So, but yeah, it can always be one of these stories, because what you're doing in a 1,200, 1,500 word story, you're taking a snapshot of somebody, and a snapshot isn't a life. It's it's a situation. So many times, I think with Dolores, we traveled with Dolores long enough that we really got a feeling for her life. What I also felt, that I will say honestly, that I'm a big subscriber of Harper's Magazine. I've gotten Harper's for like 35 years. And there was a big story in Harper's about, it was a different tact, but it was about this whole gypsy crowd of people who live in their RVs and travel around. And there's a town in Arizona where they go in the winter and they camp.
Yeah,
so,
we've seen that story, and it was
Yeah.
of course we have the Amazon up here where that crowd, the RV crowd, helps out, gets paid work at Amazon.
You'll see them. And so they made a movie of it with Frances McDormand, right? She played the characters. So I read this story, and I say to a photographer colleague, we need to do a version of this, and what can we do? And so we went out I found, I found Dolores. And then I kind of felt like I was a little bit late to the game because I know I'd already gotten word that was like being in the making of a movie. And so with that one, I felt I was, because a lot of friends of mine saying, and not to say that Dolores herself, may she rest in peace. God love you, Dolores. I know I do. That she deserved a book on her own because she was a fascinating woman. It wasn't so much what her situation was, because she was just funny. And I remember I asked her once before we met on the phone, and her husband had died years ago, and I said, Dolores, isn't it lonely? And being out there by yourself all the time. And she paused, and she said, well, John, the time so I found myself most lonely was when I've been married. So I think it's easy. You might. I know my wife knows what she's talking about, but yeah. So the driving motivation for all of this, what I've done before, what I will do in the future, is I want to have adventures, and I don't want to sit too long in places, and I want to go out and kind of I love meeting new people, and I love going back into going back to the office after spending time with Dolores or after spending time with Richard and Jack, and saying to myself, okay, these are wonderful people. They have the Shakespearean amount of depth, and nobody knows they exist, and they're out there and they write them off as being flyover people or old people, desperate old people. I have a gift and a skill of writing. I'm going to apply that to bring these people to life as accurately as I can, to show people, and people will call me after I profile them, and they'll say, God, thank you, that was so beautiful. I go, no, man, that's all you. I mean, I just picked up, I can't write it without the stuff. This is who you are. Yep. And and more. So that's where I go.
Did you?
No, I thought you had a question.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was actually fascinated when you mentioned the abandoned phone booth in the Mojave. Yeah. That was something that I was going to ask you about. And you said that I guess that went a little bit viral. So do you feel like sometimes, as you mentioned with Dolores, there is the right place at the right time to find these stories? It's that snapshot in time, and that maybe you have to use that, some part of you to determine whether or not that story is even worth writing, because maybe, the time has passed or something. Do you have problems determining what stories you should pick up and which ones you shouldn't?
I have problems convincing my wife that they're valid stories. The Mojave Desert phone booth ran in a section of the LA Times called the Column 1. And the Column 1 newspaper front pages are 6 columns. And it goes from left to right as you're looking at the headline. And so the Times had this, I think the A had the Wall Street Journal have, where they were like kind of narrative writing on the front page. And you never knew, Column 1, you were going to have a Mojave Desert phone booth, or getting television, getting phone service in Paris, to having a maid in India. The LA Times had writers all over the world, and the best writing would be, they would select it for engaging stories for the Column 1. So it ran on Column 1, and the next day after it ran, somebody wrote a letter to the editor when they still had those things, and they printed them in the paper, and it said, the guy said, I look at my Saturday morning paper and I see this stupid story about this phone booth, and is this a newspaper, or is this a tattletale gossip sheet? And when I said, my wife, I told her what I want to do, she goes, that's not a story. And then when she read that, she goes, see, but those of us who think we're in the know, and I'll tell you very briefly, it's really funny that there was an editor, Roger Smith, and all he did, and with plus more, but he was the editor of this column. So he would make sure that he would edit them and stuff. So editors would come from all over the paper, from business, from Metro, from the San Diego County edition, from the foreign editor, and they'd say, hey, Roger, I got a really good one for you. And so can we send it along? And so Roger would look at the story and he would read it. If he liked it, we'd get to it. Hey, Roger has accepted your story as a Column 1. Well, my editor went over to Roger when I said, hey, his name is Lenny Bernstein. I go, hey, Lenny, I got this kind of cool story I told him about this phone booth in the middle of the desert. People call from all over the world, and I'm going to drive out and answer the phone, see who calls. So Lenny went into Roger's office and told him in 3 sentences what the story was about, and Roger goes, sold, right? I was the only person to tell a story with Roger hadn't even read it yet. So yeah, I kind of have, I think that's where my trips to the outhouse are sort of like, I know what is a story. When I first arrived in Seoul, South Korea, I was, you become friends with all the other reporters, and they're usually Brits and Aussies, and they're in Korea on an assignment, and I got there, so I was a new guy in town. Nobody knew who I was, and we would get together on Friday nights, and we would go to the British Embassy, and there was a pub down there, and we would drink together, and that was sort of why we got together socially. One of the first things I saw in Seoul, which was a very crowded city, much like Tokyo or Beijing, there were just a lot of people there, and in some of the main areas, there were these, you would come across, and the sea of humanity would part, and there would be a figure, usually dressed in black, crawling along on their elbows, dragging their feet, and they would be pushing a cup in front of them. And it was sort of like, our homeless people are, they'll sit and have a sign. This one, and as I said to my assistant, who was a young Korean woman who did some writing, and my translator and my fixer, what is that? She goes, it's this weird, thing. So I spent a day with one of the guys I called the SEAL men, and I wrote about how, the Korean economy was really bad, and these guys, and so they were disabled, most of them, so they would drag themselves along. That's why they were not walking, because they couldn't walk, and they would drag themselves along the line. They had shoulder pads because their elbows were on the pavement, and so the story ran as a column one. And my first Friday at the British pub, somebody comes up and he says, hell with you, Glionna. You come into town here 1 week and you get a story that nobody else has thought of doing, and that's kind of what I do, and it's like, you've seen them. Why didn't you write about it, And people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that actually leads into my next question, because like yourself, we were military. We were stationed in Tokyo for 3 years, and we were living on the economy for part of that time. And then we came back to America. And even though we'd been living with Americans and working with Americans, there was still that culture, I don't want to say shock, but there was that culture challenge of coming back to America. After your time in Asia, when you came back, did you have that? And do you think, and if you did, how did that help your reporting skills? Because reporters, obviously, journalists are professional observers, but still you are removed from the day-to-day American life and then come back to it. Do you relate to that at all?
I certainly do. And others, it's a common feeling among expats like you guys and others. I did a story once in Shinjuku, the biggest, intersection in the world. And so, and all like five, they all come together. So I was there once, and I didn't live in Japan, but I would go to Japan on trips, and I covered the after the Fukushima and the tsunami. I did live there for a couple of months because I was there doing stories. But so I did a story about this whole event when the lights change, where all these the Japanese move, and nobody elbows one another, and you're thinking what if that would happen in Philadelphia or Detroit, there'd be fights and stuff, and so and how it moves seamlessly all the time. So I called Americans and I got their perspective, and there was one professor who was there, and he goes, when I first got to Japan, I was always bumping into things. I was catching corners around, when I was in offices, or when I got into a jail flight, it was a little snug, around my hips, the seats were, and then he said, then I realized it really wasn't me. I hadn't gained any weight. The Japanese are used to living in a lot smaller space. They live in kinds of paper walls, and so they can do this dance that we would not be able to do. One time I came home from Korea, and I'm a pretty friendly guy. I've been accused by my wife and others of just sometimes overtly friendly. I say hi to strangers. Hey, what's up, man? I just like to, and I engage with people. And in Korean culture, they do not say hello on the street to strangers. They basically mind their own business. So, and they also don't apologize. They're in public apologies. If you run into somebody in a crowded, train station, you're not going to get how Americans will fall over them. Oh, I'm so sorry. But so I came home from a break, and I was in San Francisco, and I found myself kind of walking around, and I realized then that I had created this Korean-esque kind of social wall around myself. I wasn't saying hello to people, and it wasn't me. I off. It's just it was in vogue because I was used to it, and so it didn't take me long when I got back to the States to sort of go back to me. But yeah, it's totally weird. And I'm, did you guys, what was your biggest challenge when you were coming back?
Well, one of the things that we picked up was how the bowing. So you would bow to passerbys in the street, and there was a different level of bowing depending on how much respect you were showing for elderly. And
And
for example,
the phrase was that, Americans will never understand bowing.
right.
So,
But we still picked it up. And when we were coming back, I
yeah.
think I still do it to this day. And this was more than 30 years ago. Every once in a while, I'll be walking past somebody and I'll just do a quick head nod. And it's kind of become ingrained in me because we did pick that up when we were wandering around Tokyo.
And we, living on the
was-
economy. So this has been fascinating so far. We're coming up against a time wall. So we're gonna start asking these questions of you.
Okay.
And we're going to abbreviate them because we are running up against time. And you've already answered some of these questions. And that's fine. That's what we want. We engineered these questions so viewers of this podcast, listeners of this podcast, will learn a little bit more about Tom and develop connections to you, sir. So, look, I may have already answered this question. Who is your writing role model and why?
Well, you mentioned Steinbeck, and you mentioned, his writing. I just got a book of letters that Steinbeck wrote to a good friend of his before he was writing East of Eden, and he was sort of getting ready. And every day he would write kind of stream of consciousness to a friend who gave him a book and said, getting his writing going. And I like when I grew up reading John Steinbeck, and one of my writers you may not know of him is Gary Smith. He used to be a reporter writer for Sports Illustrated. Gary was just really could immerse himself in writing. I like Cormac McCarthy because he's a break from. I'm not Cormac, but I mean, I read particularly nonfiction. I rarely read fiction because I think that nonfiction is fascinating. Writer, I need to read, and I always call reading breathing in and writing breathing out. And so you're influenced by what you read. So I look at stuff like Ted Conover, who went into Sing Sing, as a guard and wrote a book about it. I look for good writing and adventures. And so, William Vollmann is another writer that I if a new book comes up by Vollmann, but I'm an equal opportunity imitator. And so I will, if I see something and, I'm reading a book now by this guy called My Bygone War, I Miss It So, and he covered the Bosnian War in the late 1990s. Anthony Lloyd is his name, and he was a heroin addict and a former British serviceman, and he writes so eloquently about the war because he was a war watcher, and he was fascinated by conflict and combat. And so, but in his hands, writing about the atrocities and about being in a war, just like, imagine getting on a plane and rather than landing in Tokyo, you land in a war zone. You land in Kiev. And so, okay, what am I going to do? Like, I don't work for anybody. How can I get part of this thing? So I need to get it onto the front lines. Where's the latest battle? I'm going to take a bus and go there. It's just like, it's crazy. But got seat of the pants, right? And he writes well. So it's not so much who, but what. That's what I look for.
Excellent. Okay, so back-to-back questions. What do you love about writing?
Well, what I love about writing is that it engages a part of your brain that you're subconscious that you don't get by just having a conversation. Sometimes I'll say to somebody, I'm going to write about X, Y, or Z, and they'll say, what are you going to say? And I say, I don't know until I get there. And so I'll start writing with a concept, and then a synapse will happen. I was taking a hike with my wife the other day, and I was laughing about an experience I had 25, 30 years ago with my first wife. We were scuba diving off the Great Barrier Reef. We were doing a night dive, and we were very much novice divers. I almost killed her because I ran out of air, and we weren't neutrally buoyant in the darkness. We were sinking, and it was horrible, and we both survived. And I laughed at it because I can laugh 30 years later. And as I got to get into writing, I started writing in the beginning yesterday. I realized that it took me to, well, why was she so angry, and what were the faults of our marriage? And so it's become more of just a one-off experience that, hey, I almost killed my wife in a diving accident. How did I fail her as a husband? And this is just one example of that, and so writing takes you places you never really knew. And then when you do the first thing I do, and I know this is part of the question, but I read my work aloud. I had an editor, Steve Padilla, who was my editor at the LA Times. And when I got, like, for example, when I read you, you get a feeling of something, and when I read it aloud to you, I can say, okay, yeah, that is, if writing is like a piece of music and you play it, you don't just look at the notes, you listen to it. And so listening to music, you can tell where there's, there should be maybe an adjective, or you don't need a word there, or a phrase that falls. So reading work out loud is an important part of the process.
Okay, that was such a cool answer. I'm just digesting it. And on that almost calling your wife thing, that would have been bad. So what do you absolutely dread about writing?
What I dread about, well, I used to dread a lot more. I mean, when I was young, I mean, there was you look at we would look at the empty page on the typewriter. Today kids write, if they're not using AI to write their work for them, they're, staring at the blank, screen. It's something. And I would say that writing, I will tell people that writing doesn't really get any that much easier, but the product is better. And when people go in, and I always tell like kids about writing, it's like someone will say to me, call me up and say like, God, that was a beautiful piece. It's so good. You realize what a good writer you are? I go, I better be. That's the only thing I've ever done in my entire life. What if I gave 45 years to them and I was a shitty carpenter? Like, what would that say about? And I said, like writing is like going to the gym. You get in there and you pick up a 5-pound barbell and you go, this hurts. And then after you see these guys and they're doing 200 on each side, that's where your writing gets you. You find yourself doing it, but it's still a challenge because you want to make it good and you want to make it the best it can be. And so that's where the challenge lies. You would settle for something less as a younger writer, just to get it done. In my memory, it's, oh my God, I'm finally done with that thing. I never want to see it again. But now I'm harder to let go of a piece of writing because I go back and I say, I'll sleep on this one more time. And my favorite time as a writer is waking up in the morning with a cup of coffee and rereading the last 500 words I've written, and then launching into the next 500 words, fixing what was there when I've got. I'm like a grease fire when I have a lot of energy in the morning, and it's like, boom, I got my coffee. And then around 2, I started to get tired. So like, okay, I'm going to make calls and, call about my phone service because I know my writing time is in the morning. And so that's where I can get over that frustration, or coffee helps. Good cup of coffee will make anybody a good writer, in my opinion.
We agree.
So considering the sum of your professional experience, this was a fun one. Would you recommend the writing life to a loved one, and why?
Writing life. Interesting. Well, it depends what you mean by the writing life. I mean, the journalism life, I think journalism is sort of failing us as a career for young people to go into. I don't really know how it's going to manifest itself. I mean, I'm sure you read that the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is not going to be starting at the end of the year in October. They're not going to be in print anymore. And slowly, we're going to, go. But some people still need to write online copy. They still need people to do it. Whether you can hold it, it's palpable, you're looking on the screen. So supposedly there will be this stuff. I would not recommend the journalism life, unfortunately, for young people. If I had a son, was because I, care about this and they're going to have to change careers. The writing life, as far as like being a writer, if you can maintain yourself. I'm lucky that my wife is a very successful woman, and I'm sort of her kept pet, and I can do my writing, and she'll go off to work, and and she works, and for a while she didn't kind of get it that I'm in my 60s, so I don't live on my writer's wage. I would be homeless if I did. You can't make your mark, and so just. The first time that I have a website, johnglionna.com, and when I first developed my website, my wife goes, oh, it looks good. Now, how are you going to monetize this? So that was years ago. So I slowly got her to accept the fact that, and I will tell you, I mean, I'm being totally honest, and, and I think Rich would admit as well, we've joked about this, Rich Moreno, we all know, another writer in Nevada, that, when I write a book, I have an editor, a professional editor named Glenn Stout. Glenn used to be the editor of the Best American Sports Writing. And Glenn he's a sports writer and an editor, and he's a great thinker. So I will have Glenn edit, like for No Friday Night Lights, and a book that I just finished about Italy. I went back to southern Italy for a couple summers writing about my heritage there. And Glenn will edit the book before I even propose it to publishers. And so I pay Glenn. Glenn's a hired gun. So I'm thousands of dollars in the red before I even go out, but I don't do it for that. And I will say this, that, for all people that for writers who are listening, I once, sort of was at a Las Vegas book festival, and a woman raised her hand and said, I can't seem to break into the big publishers, and I don't know what to do. And do you have any suggestions? I go, hell with the big Madison Avenue publishers. I said, self-publishing these days are making it a lot easier. Don't let big business tell you that your voice shouldn't be heard. You go, you get your work out there. There's a lot of situations where people have self-published, got on Amazon, then they've gotten contracts before. So you go and you get your writing out there, and so I'm very happy with being published by university presses. People will say, well, why didn't you go to HarperCollins? I said, well, the cheerleader wouldn't go to the prom with me. So I went out. I'm going with that girl with the glasses that I met in the library. And I'm still going to the prom, and I'm probably still going to get laid. It's like, but that's where I'm going. And the way I liken my relationship to the University of Nevada Press or Nebraska, I feel like a columnist in a 5,000 circulation paper. Very small, it would be covering the area, but I know that when I write my 3-time-a-week column, that every subscriber is going to be waiting for that to hit their doorstep, and they're going to read it. Every one of the 5,000. My saturation is going to be high. Then, so a small publisher would come to me saying, hey, that was a good book, John. What do you got next? Versus like writing in this vacuum, thinking, I'm having a hard time selling my Italy book, and I put it in a hiatus because it is not a great time to be out there, it's selling books. And so that is, that's a big frustration for a lot of writers. Whereas where do you go, where do you go when you're done? A guy once asked me on an interview whether I really would sell her, and I said that would probably be the worst thing that could ever happen to me, because I can imagine, and I love doing this, but I mean, this is fun talking to you guys. But if I had to do 3 of these today and then go to Boston and then do 2 more with radio, and you guys are well informed, you've read the material, for somebody who hasn't even read the book and they're, I don't know, who is this guy? That takes away from the task at hand, which is writing. Excuse me.
Yep. We understand, because there's an old saying that for bands, that if you don't want to sing a successful song for the rest of your life, don't record a successful song. So it's probably along the same lines of what you're saying there. Once you hit those big 5 publishers, you're bar.
And there's an old joke that said, how do you make a musician depressed? Get him a gig. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Last question, and again, we're running up against the time wall here, but I really want to ask this question. What is something fun and unexpected from your past that we won't see in your bio?
One time I was coming back from northern Nevada with a story for the Review Journal. In fact, we were coming back the first time I met Richard and Jack. So if you know how big Nevada is, people don't realize how long. It's like 500 miles north to south. So we were going from McDermott, the Oregon border. We had to drive back to Vegas. So it was a long drive. So we knew we had to stop. We stopped in Tonopah halfway. But we were driving, and we got to a diner in the sort of along the Highway 50 to stop in for. We'd left in the morning, and we got up really early, and so we were sitting in there. We'd ordered coffee and our breakfast, and there was a guy who was several tables over, and he looked at me with a very uncomfortable gaze, and he held his eye contact a little longer, like you might do in a singles bar for the 80s or in a gay bar in San Francisco. It was laser like. And I looked down and I said to my photographer colleague, check that guy out. And he looked over, he goes, yeah, no, there's something going on there. So when I went up to get a coffee refill, I said to the bartender, hey, what's up with that guy? She goes, oh, that's Bob. Bob, I go, who's Bob? Well, Bob's been here for about 5 years. About 5 years ago, Bob was released from a mental hospital in California, and they gave him a bike, and so he was riding along Highway 50 in the middle of the summer, and the owner saw him, and he was near death, and they kind of adopted him, and he's lived here for the last 5 years, and he helps around, and he's got a shed out back. And she goes, but the really interesting thing about Bob is Bob has multiple personalities, and one of them's a woman. And I go, really? And she goes, well, yeah, we never know if he's appearing as a woman until his voice goes up a few octaves. So I went back to my photographer friend, and I go, holy shit. And I told him, and so he said, let's do a story about Bob. We got to do a story about Bob. And so the owner came in, and she came over, and I said, hey, we're reporters. We want to do this. And here's our story. We're not going to make fun of Bob, his mental illness. This story says something about Nevada, that you would be so accepting of somebody like Bob and give him employment. And in fact, regulars at the place I was in had a fight and a kind of a scrape with a bar down the road because they were jealous of all the people that were coming in, and they were saying that Bob was like a pedophile and stuff. So they were protecting Bob's honor. So she said, oh yeah, that's great. She said, Bob, come here for a second. So Bob comes over, and he's standing there, all of a sudden deer in the headlights. She goes, this gentleman's a writer, and he'd like to do a story about you. And I said, well, not today, Bob. I said, I'm going to China, and I'm going to be back in a month or so, but I want to come back up when I get back. And Bob was like, not saying anything. And so I go, okay. And then Bob went off, and his social skills probably need a little dusting off. And so I went to China, and I came back, and I called the owner when I got back, and I said, hey, I'm ready to come up. She goes, we can't do the story. I said, why? She goes, the day after you came in here, Bob disappeared for 3 weeks. And basically they found him, brought him back. The point of the story is Bob didn't want to be found. Bob didn't want to be written about. And so Bob's story is one that you're not gonna read about because I couldn't tell that story. But I like to tell the story because it says a lot about what Nevada is, and I hope Bob's doing well out there, whoever manifestation he is today, so you gotta love it.
Okay, wow. Excellent. Yeah. Okay, so tell us where we can find you on the internet. Where can we find your books, especially your excellent Rebels and Outliers, Real Stories of the American West?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that, JT. The book is on Amazon. You can buy it. All 3 books, you can find them on Amazon. And my website is my first name, last name.com, JOHNGLIONNA.com. And what I'm doing there is a lot of my work is on there. I have a blog that I write there as well. I'm going to be, a week after next, I'm going to be at the Reno Lit Crawl, and I'm going to be on a panel talking about writing about the West. And so that's always a great event. I've been there before. And then in October, I think it's a Wednesday night, October 8th, I'm going to be addressing the Nevada Historical Society. And they're doing renovations on their building, so it's somewhere else. And I wish I remember it's some club somewhere, but we're going to be addressing them. And I've actually got, one of your television stations actually has a book segment in the morning. So I'm going to be on Reno television in the morning and doing some stuff. So yeah, I'm going to be Reno centric the next couple of weeks. But if anyone is out there and likes what you hear, certainly you can reach out to JT and CC, but my email address is my first name last name @gmail.com, john.glionna@gmail.com. If you read one of my books and you like it or don't like it, please reach out to me. I love hearing, and when I do book signings, I always put my email address on there. I love hearing from readers. It's important, to hear what readers are thinking about. I made the offer to young writers. If you're struggling with something, I can give you one old man's, point of view. So, by the way, I just did a search on a word that I know, words that have the word geezer. And I just love because, we call each other. So I looked at apparently the geezer's from the 1950s. So if you want one old geezer's advice, then, john.glionna@gmail.com.
Excellent. Thank you, sir.
That's very cool.
That's very cool. And let's just go ahead and wrap that up by thanking John for joining us here on the CC and JT Amateur Hour, where we have been doing a continuous series of writers from around the world, from between Carson City and Britain. And John's a little close to home, who, whether he likes it or not, is a Nevadan. We'll just say you're a Nevadan. I don't know where you are right now, but you're a Nevadan because you know so much about it and you do it so well.
Well, I just wanted to add this. You can cut this, JT, but the Amateur Hour is a wonderful title because myself and what we were talking about how struggling writers struggle to get out. I have a photographer colleague who goes off with me, and her work is in No Friday Night Lights and several of the books. Her name's Randy Lynn Beach. She lives in the Bay Area, and she went to get her taxes done. And she was saying, well, I want to do a write-off on this. And her tax person said, well, write-off because you don't make enough money. You're not, in the eyes of the government, you're not seen as a professional. You're a hobbyist. So that's what Randy and I call ourselves now. We're hobbyists. So, we're amateurs, hobbyists, but, it's a good place to be, less pressure.
Yeah.
Very true.
Professional hobbyists.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening. This has been incredibly fascinating, and hopefully we can have you on the show once again, John. Anyway, take care, everybody.
Okay, take care. Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
bye.
Okay.